Leading off our discussion now, Jill Wine-Banks, former assistant Watergate special prosecutor and MSNBC legal analyst, and Mimi Rocah, former federal prosecutor. She's now a fellow at Pace University Law School and an MSNBC contributor. And Jill, it was just a quick 44 years ago that that Richard Nixon yesterday was handing over those tapes, and 3 days later was gone. On the anniversary of that moment of the handing over the tapes, we get this just extraordinarily strange tweet from the president. And since I read that tweet, all I've been wondering about is why. Can you make any sense of the why that tweet would go out?
I have long since given up trying to figure out why the president does anything, because almost none of it makes any sense. That was very harmful, not just to his son, who he was throwing under the bus by admitting the real purpose of the meeting, but to him as well, because he drafted a fake report about why the meeting happened. So now he's admitting to obstruction of justice, not just to working with the Russians. And you clearly defined what the law is. You cannot accept anything. And if you tried to get it but failed, you've attempted to violate the law. And that's just as much a crime as actually taking it. If I go into a bank and say, give me your money, and you refuse, I've still tried to rob your bank, and I can be tried for a crime. So the fact that he didn't succeed, or at least says he didn't, and as you pointed out, we don't know whether he actually got dirt or not. We certainly know that there was an announcement that there would be dirt, and then there was a leak of the emails. So did they know that that's what was going to happen? That would be conspiring with the Russian government to hurt the election, and that's a crime.
Mimi Rocah, we don't know if the president had help with this tweet. We don't know if someone else gave him that fancy big word fabrication instead of the word lie. But if he did have help with this tweet, if he had someone, a lawyer, looking over his shoulder on this tweet, can you find any conceivable legal theory that would suggest this tweet could be somehow helpful?
I don't think he had a good lawyer helping him if he had a lawyer helping him. But
okay.
So no, I don't see a great legal theory. The best I can make of it are two things. One, that he sees the writing on the wall about his son, and that all arrows point to his son is going to likely be charged with something in relation to this meeting. And he's trying to engender some kind of sympathy. My poor son, who just kind of fell into this because he was trying to help me become president, and woe is him. I don't know. And look, there are some people out there, some Trump supporters who may go along with that and feel that, and this is part of the witch hunt without using the word witch hunt. And then, of course, there's the second part of the tweet of, what he's done in this tweet is he's, after 100 tweets of no collusion, he now has basically said, without using the words in this tweet, yes, collusion, but, it was my son, and I feel bad for him, and I didn't know about it. So he's trying to distance himself. It's a total what we call false exculpatory, what he says about his knowledge. And it looks false because it is. And so I think, again, if he had a lawyer advising him, it was not a good lawyer.
And Jill, the idea that this is helpful to the president himself alone, saying that this is a way of saying that the president isn't guilty of anything, I still can't think of any reason to put that in a tweet, even if that's what the president believed, that he wasn't guilty of anything.
I think Mimi hit it on the head, which is he's not getting very good legal advice. And something she said also reminded me of why, for example, Rosemary Woods was never indicted for perjury. She testified, she erased 18.5 minutes and described how she did the erasure. And the testimony showed that that did not happen. But we didn't indict her because it would have been a distraction. I don't think the same is true with Donald Trump Jr. Donald Trump Jr. played a pivotal role in the campaign, and he is not just some assistant to the president who shouldn't be indicted. If he did, as his email said, please give me the dirt, I love it, especially release it later in the summer when it'll do maximum damage, that's an indictable crime, and he should be tried for it.
Mimi, if Donald Trump Jr. solicited this information from Russian nationals without knowing that that was a crime, how does that factor into charging this crime or defending against this charge?
He doesn't have to know that it's a crime. What he has to have a sort of general intent here that he knew, what he was doing. So here he knew he was accepting information, whether it be, actual documents. I mean, when we talk about dirt, as you mentioned, it could just be that they told him they were going to do something or that they had access to information, and that's why, Trump made that announcement. So he does not have to know. Ignorance of the law is no defense, and people are familiar with that. There are some crimes where you have to have a more specific intent, but I think here it would have to be general knowledge about the conduct that he was doing, not the specific law that he was violating. And in particular, if we're talking about conspiracy law, he could be liable for joining a conspiracy that the Russians already had underway when they hacked into the Democratic emails and had them in their possession. You can join a conspiracy at any time. You don't have to be there from the beginning, as long as you're aware of the general object of the conspiracy and you knowingly join it and then do something in furtherance, which, again, all arrows point to Trump Jr. did that.
Mimi Rocah and Jill Wine-Banks, thank you both for starting us off tonight. Really appreciate it. Thanks for checking out our YouTube channel. Subscribe by clicking on the button below for more from The Last Word and the rest of MSNBC.